let's revisit very quickly what we did last week. We took a little walk around a very famous Parisian cafe and visited Sacré-Cœur. So exploring line and color, the balance between it, how we use the technique for drawing using the negative space, blind drawing techniques. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these pages, and as you notice, I'm working on this sketchbook because the idea of the design of this class was for you to also compose sort of a booklet, a page after page, as you examine working with ink and color. What I want to do here, and again, you could do this in your sketchbook or separately on a separate sheet of paper. We are going to work with watercolor. I want to show you what I'm going to be working with today. Obviously, I have pencil. I use mechanical pencil just for the quality. If I use pencil, I'll be using mechanical pencil for the sharp line, quality of line. I have these fine liners and the microns as well, which I recommended. And I have several different sizes, the gauge line. I go from 0.8 all the way to 0.05. But I also have these, which are just a deeper black, and this is the Faber-Castell, which is just black, and this dark sepia, which I'll also be using. So you can hardly see the quality of color, but it's there. This one's black, this one's dark sepia, but when I draw the lines, you'll see that. So I'll be using a variation of these. I also have a fountain pen. This fountain pen, which I load up with cartridges of water-soluble ink, and I want to show you how that also applies if you can get a hold of one of these. There's also just these ballpoint pens, and there's so many, from the 30-cent, the Bic type pens, all the way to $5-7 pens that are just ballpoint pens. The qualities of the inks that you're going to find in these ink pens, you're going to see how permanent or how water soluble some of those inks are. And it just takes testing different pens, different types of ink, and the washes, the watercolor washes that we do, to really see what it is that you like. So for this first exercise, what I want you to do is this. I want you to, very simply, I'm going to take this page, and remember, I'm composing these pages, so this would be my intro. I would label this and maybe do some sketches. I also mentioned journaling or writing, so we'll do that as well. And as you compose the pages, I showed you how to do a masking for frames, so we could do close-ups of detail or color swatches, also journaling, lettering. On this side, I'll do some of these studies or sketches, and this first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pencil, and I'm going to try to fit maybe 4 to 6 cubes. What I want you to think about is this. So how do I draw a cube? I'm going to start, there's several ways, but I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is just a square. Now, remember, it's about drawing. It's about giving yourself quality of line. It does not have to be ruler perfect, but if you feel you have to go for that quality of line where it's just almost architectural engineering like, well, then you do that. But me, I'm looking for playful. Yes, obviously, if I'm looking for a straight line, I want to capture that straight line. Ooh, I might have gone a little bit fast here. So what did I do? I have a square. And then what I want to do is I want to find the angle. So this diagonal right here, and I want to match it to this one and this one. And then I just realized that this vertical is parallel to this one and to this one, and then connect the points. My horizontals, this one is parallel to this one, and then also parallel to this one. So 3 parallel lines diagonally, 3 parallel lines vertically, and then they just connect at the angle. So depending on how much angle you add to these diagonals, that's the quality of cube that you're going to have. So here's my pencil. And as I do this, I'm going to take my brush, and I'll show you the brushes in just a second. But I am going to use this water brush, the water pen, Pentel. I'm going to go for a little bit of blue watercolor here. And we kind of did this last week, where I'm going to start with a little bit of deeper color. Need a little more water. I'm going to start with a little bit of a deeper color here. What I want to practice here are watercolor techniques. So that is a wet on dry. I'm going to take a little less color, more water, and thin that down. I'm going to apply it also wet on dry. And how close am I going to come to the edge here so they bleed? Oop, there it is. And now that just became wet on wet. And by adding more water yet to the top one, sometimes you have to tap it on a paper towel, really get the pigment off. I'm going to really lighten this one at the top. So I just want to have a cube that I can develop through pencil line. I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow here. Just like that. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to play with different variables of line and wash, or line and color. What is another one? Now I'm going to jump way ahead here. Just trust me on this one. I'm going to do a variation of colors. Actually, if you stick with the same color, you may be able to see it easier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to, based on this cube, I'm just going to add a quick wet on dry wash. And I'm going to bring in a little more wet on wet. And I'm just going to do sort of a spot of color there. Why? I'm going to let it dry for a while. And then I'm going to come back and draw over that dry layer. So it obviously takes a little bit of strategy, a little bit of planning. I know you may not visualize it yet. Well, what kind of spot do I want to do here? The idea is to really just spatter or lay down just an interesting looking spot of watercolor that may be a streaky, swirly, circular. Thinking, of course, of the size of the cube that I'm going to draw after. Here we go. Next one. I'm going to use a permanent ink. So for this one, I'm going to use the Faber-Castell. And I'm going to draw another cube right here. This one's going to be a little bit smaller. Maybe I could also play with variations of cubes, different angles. Make this one a little more like a box with a little more perspective. Gosh, sorry about that. This camera is really struggling with this. With this focus. So you saw I have my ink with the fine liner, my ink lines. What I want to do next is water. And I basically watered the whole cube. I could do this in sections. And what I want to do is wet on wet. Now, how do I prepare, how do I visualize a wet on wet technique? It does take a little bit of practice. What kind of stroke? How do you load the brush? Do I need to layer it? And I just like tapping. I like a little more of the quality of when you lay it down, it almost kind of explodes. It really just stains the page. So it's not really brushing it, it's almost just touching it right on the wet surface. And let's extend this a little bit forward and make that once again a shadow. And notice here, it's wet. The other thing is how wet. And just tapping the watercolor on there. So there's another variation of a cube. I'm checking on this one here. Still damp. So I don't want to play with that just yet. I am going to show you a water-soluble ink. Now, if you don't have this, so you do have pencil, you do have micron. The other option would be a cube that is ink, but wet on dry. So for this one, I just want to show you, if you have a pen that is water soluble, or if you consider water soluble inks, how that's going to affect not just the line, the quality of the line, how you can use them as they also bleed some of the color. And you have obviously black ink, sepia inks, blue inks, all colors of inks that are permanent or water soluble. So when they're water soluble, just touching a bit of water, you see what happens here? And obviously this ink is still very wet. So I just did that to show you the qualities of adding water to water-soluble ink and what I can do with the line. But if I continue with the same idea that we've been working with, which is just bringing color, and how that color, now I did again, wet on dry. As I touch these lines, notice how that color and the color combination of the ink and watercolor that I apply gives me these very beautiful tones. It mixes, it creates shadows. It's basically shades because you're mixing it, in this case, with black ink and that bluish hue of the watercolor. Now I'm going really, really experimental here with some of these techniques. I could lift some of that. And let's go ahead and add another shadow. So here I would reintroduce a few lines of ink. And now they're going to be a little bit lighter, not too heavy, so it doesn't overpower. So just a few strokes, a few lines, a little more watercolor, and let that bleed in with. And be surprised by it. Now, notice how this look, pencil watercolor. Oh, I love that. Obviously, it's not what we're going for, but how you can use it. We'll get here. Ink and watercolor, wet on wet, how we did it mostly last week. Let me go ahead and do my ink. Now the quality of the line, the heaviness of the line, meaning the thickness, the look of it, and how you blend that in with watercolor is, I guess it's pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about over and over and over. How do you create that look by somewhat looking at the balance between line and color? So this was wet on wet over here. This one's going to be wet on dry. And I think I'm going to make, let's see, this one dark again. So wet on dry, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply a thin layer. So my lightest layer, wet on dry, over the entire thing. Notice that I'm going loosely, a little bit outside of the line. That's a stylistic approach. You may want to go a little slower inside the lines. So while this dries just a little bit, I'm going to apply. It's not necessarily wet on dry again because it's still wet. So the first layer is wet on dry, but now that it's wet and drying, I could bring in a second layer, and now this is wet on wet. So the first layer wet on dry, second layer wet on wet, and we're talking about layers now. And I could add it all the way through these two sides, where you still see a bit of the transparency from the previous layer. And notice already how much richer, a little variant to the quality. Now I would have to let this dry just a little bit more, and finding what's called that magic timing, the perfect timing. When it's not wet, it's not damp, it's right in the middle, it's moist. And for you, that's where all the magic, that's what you're looking for, and how to control that timing, the moisture on the paper. So I'm adding another wet on wet layer, pretty much the same consistency of the first. No, actually not the first. The first was really light. But you see how layer by layer. So this is 3 layers of the same color. The first one wet on dry. And as I progressed, I added wet on wet. And then a third wet on wet. A little more saturated. But you could wait until these layers are fully dry. And then add your second layer again, wet on dry. And the third one, wet on dry. And they will be much more glazed when you do that. So here we have it. We have this dry. So what I did is I just swooshed some watercolor on there. I did wet on dry with a touch of wet on wet. And having this as my basically my canvas on the paper, what I want to see is how can I use these areas, these spots, to then develop within that a different look. So it's kind of drawing almost on an abstract, using the chance of what was there, and then bringing it up just a little bit further. Hopefully in the same way you did the first. You don't want to over control and be able to go outside the lines. Let's leave this spot for you to come up with one. What other variation of this could you come up with? Well, okay, we drew the pencil lines. That's basic. We drew the color first, then the line. That was interesting. Line, wet on dry, wet on wet. I'm sorry. These interesting. If I have the quality of pen or the quality of ink. What if... I'm going to try this one. What if I basically draw with my watercolor? Now, this one would be a little too linear, so I'm going to go ahead and fill it in. So I'm drawing my square first. But notice how I wasn't painting. I was more drawing it. Now looking for some of those lines. Going a little bit into wet on wet. And how much cleaner it looks. Now, how I manage the edges and how I control what is color as line. So how do I make that line become color, or the color reach the edge of becoming line, if that makes any sense? See, for example, here at these edges, I could lose that line quality that I was doing through color. Now, I would use this maybe as one of those where you could develop color in order to then add line, a little bit more control than this one. And hopefully I'm not going too fast, because the truth is I cannot, well, first of all, I don't consider myself a teacher. There's nothing I could teach you. You are your best teacher. I'm just an information facilitator. That's the best I can come up with. I have some information that I think works that I could facilitate, pass on. You are going to make the decisions. Oh, well, definitely not that. Oh, I like that. Maybe the way I would do this is this way. That's what I'm hoping you find out and begin to explore. Be creative. That's really what we're going for here. How do I become creative with the tools, the instruments, the medium, using sharpness of line, techniques of color, that playful looseness of my brushstroke, all of these different things. And these are just, call it 6 variations. But when you think of wet on dry, wet on wet, those two techniques and how you can bend, push, and pull those, the extreme of those, plus line, different types of line, and the timing of when the line comes, you're almost multiplying. The variables are truly infinite. And we're only working with one color, by the way. So when you begin to play with different colors, different lines, different types of lines, that is going to get really interesting. And that is where we're going today. So with this quick exercise, I'm going to move to our first page. And yes, you see it here, a pencil. So you can work from the image on the screen, or if you have a pencil in front of you that looks a little more interesting, go ahead and set it somewhere on the side of your desk, using it as a reference, as your model. What I want you to do is come up with a strategy. And here we're going to get into, is it photorealistic? Is it more of an illustration of a pencil? Or is it fine art? The differences between comic. Is it just a comic rendering? Is it, what is it? What is the look that you're going to go for here? When you think about that, well, then the way you approach it. For me, I'm going to make this straight with pen. I am going to use the sepia pen that I mentioned earlier. The Faber-Castell Fine Liner, which has a sepia tone color of ink. I'm going to use my grip. And yes, drawing with ink is a little bit trickier than drawing with pencil or charcoal, where I always recommend using your drawing grip, not your writing grip to draw. I want you to use a variation of this grip where you can control the pressure and also the pace, also giving it much more honesty is what I call it to your line. And I'm gonna consider the next thing. I have several images, so we're gonna do a pencil, a pen, a brush, an eraser, maybe something else you have there, a sharpener. But do you want to do them all in one page? Do you want to do two in one page? So the composition of a page, do I just do one whole pencil in this page? That's what I'm going to do. For this first page, I'm going to give it all to the pencil. So my drawing, is it going to go straight across this way? Yeah, I'm going to use a quick straight line. And what I want to do is begin to think about my drawing method. My line is going to be really squiggly, hoping to stay as straight as possible. Adding a little bit of that edge and detail that I see in the metal part here towards the eraser. So I'm looking at some of those details as I come up with the eraser. And now I'm going to consider the thickness. And I do see it's not round. It's more of a hexagon. And I notice some of the curvature. So here it begins to look more like a cube. But I also see a variation in the color and the shadow. And I could definitely use that for color. How am I going to add the lines? All these little lines that I see up here, and there's somewhat reflected qualities. Am I going to do that with line, or am I going to do it with color? What about all these markings here? Well, that's where we talk about how you decide to work definitions and the illustrative qualities or photorealistic qualities. And usually that's what we're going to call style. Your style. And just touching right there at the end. There's a simple drawing. Very easy. It should come easy because what you're doing, what I'm hoping you think about is just a quick study, a quick rendering. Going with the simple approach of wet on dry. And I want to do it in the same kind of way, broken a little bit, the same way I did my approach to the drawing. Give that line a little bit of, let's call it, its due. I want it to showcase. I don't want to just overpower it with color. I'm going to shift to a cool color. So using my watercolors here, I'm going to use the warm color for the wood part of it, and this cooler yellow for the metal part. I'm going to pause here, wait till this dries just a bit, and I'm going to touch it with a little bit of yellow ochre. And that same yellow ochre, I'm going to touch it with a little bit of burnt umber or a darker sepia tone. And see how this shades the side of it while still wet on wet. Now it may be looking way reddish on screen, and that may be the lighting in my studio. It's a little too warm. And that brings me to the wood part. A little bit browner. And then very dark tip, just with black. Now the lettering. Did he just ignore the whole thing there? Well, I didn't ignore it. I felt it's not needed. If I were going for that close to a little more realistic look, I would have taken the time. So mine could be considered just a little more like an illustration of a pencil. Not that that matters what you call it. Eventually, yeah, you'll analyze your own work and think, well, what works best for what usually I'm trying to convey? What does that mean? What did he just say? It's how other people will interpret it. It starts with how you see it, really. And if you just see it as, well, why am I going to draw a pencil? It's just a pencil. It's all the elements simplified. How are you deciding to use line? How are you deciding to use color? How are you balancing those out? And then through technique, I'm going to do here something. Instead of just a straight up shadow, I want to use a little swirling, almost like it was writing. And I'm going to wet that and touch it with a little bit of variation, wet on dry, wet on wet. And swirl it even further. So a little bit looser. Make sure we have a paper towel at hand in case we have a little bit of lifting to do. And now it looks like a pencil that's dripping ink. That was unintended, but I like it. I feel like I need to add just a touch of shading to this area of it. And it could be a little too much. So knowing when to stop. So I'm adding a little bit of Payne's Gray. Mostly here at the top of it. To enhance the shaded side. And that's it. Very loose drawing. Qualities and balance between line and color. What about the background? Do we need anything in the background? You could. Because we have a yellow pencil, yellow, I would go with something maybe if I needed to. Well, and I would usually do that first. Let's touch it with a little bit of, How about some ultramarine blue? Now, again, it's all of these elements. How we use space now. And how is that going to help or hurt the overall look of what I'm trying to say? Does a blank page actually serve me better for what I'm trying to do? Just enhance the qualities, the look? Or does this really now take away? This is how we learn. By making decisions and getting a reading. How did it affect it? Did it affect it? I have a little bit of, it was still wet and it's bleeding into that touch of background. So I'm going to use a dry brush to lift some of that leaking color very gently. And there it is. The power of a pencil. Expanding, exploring how you can use your techniques to create that quality, that look, while also considering a composition for the entire page. Let's go to the next one. So just flip the page, and I'm going to show you what the next two are, so you have an idea, because I may do two of them in this page. So I'm going to compose two. So we go from one single element in this page. Here, I'm going to go for a composition of two. So I'm going to consider, am I going to do them vertical? Am I going to do them horizontal? So it's going to be this, a micron pen, and the water brush. Both of these, and think of them as a composition where I'm going to start with this one here. So I have a micron. If you have one in front of you, hopefully you have two, so you can set one down and draw it with another micron if you need to. Here I'm going to try to show you, let's see, it's the composition. I'm going to go fully horizontal. That way they don't just break this. We have that earlier page with Sacré Coeur that was very vertical. Here I want to make this even more horizontal. Previous page, I went straight across, good diagonal there. It serves for composition. Here, two elements straight across, and I'm going to try to match the size. So for my micron, using the image, I do want to consider more of the details, and I'm already thinking about the color. So in terms of balance with line and color, the color is going to be minimal. It's going to be very, very light. And it's little of it. There's more of those lettering and lettering and details. So here we go. Starting with a quick measurement of how big, starting at the tip. And this is going to be my tip right here. Having a little trouble marking that right there. And now how I'm going to see small elements as little rectangles that get thinner as we reach the front. So all I'm trying to read here is not the whole micron, it's little shape by shape. Notice how they're just cylinders, or in some cases just squares or rectangles that get a little bit bigger, a little bit wider, and I'm basically just deconstructing it piece by piece with a nice, you don't see this up close, but my line is really squiggly. Let me show you that up close. I'm going to zoom in. Notice the quality of the line. Very, it almost feels like I was doing this left-handed, and actually I would do some of these left-handed just for those for that quality that I absolutely love, which takes us away from almost looking like you did them with a ruler. It's a little more you. But again, it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of style. And how you see how you can begin to see how ink and color are going to work together. At some points, ink alone can do it, because it could be such a strong drawing that just a touch of color could almost be too much. So not minimizing, but considering how far and where some of this line. Notice I'm adding just a few touches of that reflective quality where we have metal. So here, a couple of dotted little dashy lines. I am going to go for some of this, and I want to go maybe with a finer pen. And am I going to replicate everything exactly as I see it? Well, what you don't see me do is I am looking at my reference, and I'm drawing without looking at my paper. So once I have the place, so I know I starts right here. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the image, and then I'm just, in this case, just scribbling. This one I may want to take a little consideration too, because I will probably bring a pop of color in it to kind of get the shaping, the size. But again, that's all up to you. Is it an important element that you feel needs to be rendered? And then at what quality? There we go. So there's my rendering of a pen. Now I'm switching over to the water brush. Now, I just saw something interesting. The pen pointing this way, the water brush pointing that way. That could be interesting. So I'm going to switch over to black ink for this one. So this one I use the sepia ink. It is a little lighter, but I want you to see the comparison here. Now there's some of these beautiful shapes. Starting it off is always a little trickier. The space between them. I may add some text, considering some text in between. Now here we have a very interesting shape. Also the size of it, considering the front. I'm seeing where the tip is going to be, and maybe you want to work yourself backwards. So starting from this may look easier. I'm going to go ahead and just do this triangle, which I could easily see. Make sure I'm staying in a line so I don't have this bent or curved brush. And once again, we realize, what is this all about? Never forgetting, it's an exercise in observation. What you're doing here is, and should be, how am I focusing? How am I deconstructing, seeing those elements that I need to see, being able to see them clear, easier. And what I'm doing is I'm seeing the pieces and looking a little bit beyond what's actually there, looking for the structure of it. And literally deconstructing it to then be able to compose it once again in my drawing. So if I could see it, I shouldn't draw it until I know I've seen it. And I made sense of it. And then it just becomes a lot easier. So now I have this shape, and I know how it works, so I'm going to work it a little bit from here to here. And little by little, I see the widening. And then missed it a little bit here. It goes a little bit wider. And right to it. There we go. Oh, what about the cap? Well, let's put the cap somewhere over here. A little bit of a oval here, a little ellipse, and our cap. Nice little, almost looks like a cone cylinder. And I'm going to add a few very thin lines, hinting at the texture we see on there. There we go. Very simple approach to drawing the things we see right in front of us. And not to get philosophical, but now I'm going to paint the thing with the thing itself. Whoa. So this one I'm going to do a little bit of wet on wet. I have permanent ink, so I'm just adding a little bit of water. Loosely. Not too heavy. I see the ink react just a little bit to it. And I want a little bit of a looser quality. I'm going to go with a little bit of Cerulean Blue, and I'm going to go ahead and just tap it on. One little streak right through the center. And notice how it diffuses. It kind of, the water, it's that wet on wet quality that I was looking for. Where I'm not forcing the paint here. That's what I want to, I really want you to think about. Do I let the paint do its thing? Do I just let it dance and show me what it can do? Or am I trying to really force it by brushing and sometimes over brushing? What if I did a layer, let it sit, come back, revisit, and that's about all the blue, all the saturation I need for this. And look at that. It's just dispersing on the paper because it was the way I set it up, the wet on wet. And it's very rich. It actually begins to work. If I want to control it, it could be just a little too much. Going with a little bit of Payne's Gray here. And I know there's little areas, spots of white in between. So I'm going to consider that. I decided to go wet on dry. I could have gone wet on wet. But I am going to bleed that out way thinner. So I wipe my brush. No pigment on it. All of it. Just a little bit of water. And I'm going to diffuse that center towards the edges. Creating a little bit of that idea of translucency. And then this tip, very much a little more opaque, darker, saturated, with that little hint of light right in between. I'm going to take that same Payne's Gray, really, really water it down, very, very light, and just get it as gray as possible. Almost I want to say give it that idea of translucent. I wonder if wet on wet would have worked better. So let's do a test down here. Now there's other things you can do to add more interest to these. Where you have light, then we could come back with a little bit of white ink and add those highlights. I didn't do any shading, and you'll see what adding a little bit of shading does to these. If I wanted to, I could just add a tiny little shadow underneath, and it adds all of that. It really brings the illusion together. So I'm going to go with a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to touch it with a tiny bit. I had a previous mix of burnt umber. Very, very light. But what I want to do first is I want to go for it. I want to really just add water. And I'm adding it kind of not too random, but outside the lines. All over. It is a little bit wetter than... I got to go back to my image very quickly here. And just to see the color here, I'm just going to touch it on a little bit darker in certain areas, and it's going to bleed out. So I don't want to go too close to the edges. And why did you do that? Why did you add it so random, so outside the lines? Well, you're going to begin to see how it's going to bleed out. And what I want to do is kind of create a little bit of that chaos, would be the word. Where you could see unexpected things happen. And that's basically, I'm setting it up to hopefully see some unexpected things happen. I'm going to use a little bit of that same gray mixture for some of this metal. And it's going to get really, well, I guess not expanding, depending on the pigment, I guess, as well, how it's going to react. And I'm going to let that dry just a little bit. Go back down here, dry this, help it dry just a little bit more. So I'm touching it with very carefully, with the dry paper towel. And I'm going to bring in just a little bit of shading. So grabbing a little bit of Payne's Gray. Question, would wet on wet work better here? So I'm going to thin that out, and I'm actually adding just a touch of pigment to what I hope would be more clean water. That way I could see it, and then bring some of the pigment wet on wet. Now I don't want this to be way too dark. And what if, do you see some of the color in the shadows? You could add a little bit of that same color. And right away, we see the effect. Almost like you could grab it and lift it. I need to wait just a second until this is also. And do I want to do the same? Yeah, I think I want to do the same look. Now this is not touching, so you have to have a sense. If it's right in front of you and it has a shadow, make sure you look closely and imitate the shapes and the directions of those shadows. Now you may not see it, it's behind. If the light is coming from your direction, the shadow may be behind. So set yourself up so you could see. because it's not usually where it's touching. So the study of shadows, that's a whole different subject. Here we're basically, I would say roughly hinting at it, and how quickly it goes from very dark to faded, completely faded out. Notice I'm doing extra pop of dark right here, and how that immediately says, whoa, that's, okay, so that's where it's touching the table or the surface. But it fades out quickly, meaning the light is flooding. I'm also using a little bit of that wet on wet technique with the gray. I lay down as my layer. And another thing I should say is pacing yourself, to not rush, to be able to take a quick step back and see how it's working. And by a step back, I mean just pull your head back a little bit, 3-6 feet away. In the moment, before it's too late. Because we could easily overwork these very, very simple. And you could really go back and think of how many strokes of color, how many strokes. Yeah, we could almost count how many lines in some of our drawings and see how they could be very successful and efficient by working with less is more. I'm going to go a little bit extra violet on this color here. So I'm using my cool red, really. It's not violet. Although the color there looks kind of purplish on the image. I'm going a little extra red here. Maybe that was a little too much. So there's one example. Let's bring it down with a touch of blue. So using a little bit of wet on wet, and I'm going to purple it. Purple it just a little bit. So all the line that I did there is lost. Color really overpowered it. But there's always a chance to just, look at this, touch it with the paper towel and lift almost all of it. And you have a nice monotype on your paper towel here. And then revisit that. Mix your color. Make sure you get a little closer to that purple and do not make it so saturated. That was my lesson. Use the quality of the line that you have there. That's also my lesson. And there we have it. Now, as far as text, you can get very creative. I would absolutely add text. How would I add text? Same, I can't come up with one now. You name it, by just redefining what it is. Actually, I see something here that I want to add a little extra color to. Not color, but saturation. And it's this, just by adding a few dots, darken this area here, that little image. There we go. So how would I do it? I would use ink and color, or just watercolor. Let's go ahead and do that one. I'm thinking of text here. I don't want to get too complicated, so I'm just going to go with the nice. First of all, I have to think of a color that is also going to be, or make sense here. Because I have a warm and a cool blue, I would think of, let's say, what would make sense? Going a little bit warmer blue. So I'm going with Ultramarine. I'm going to make sure I have nice consistency. And with this water brush, I can actually just type it, write it. Now the type of writing is also going to be important. Do I want it really neat? Do I need a pencil line to keep me in grid? Obviously, is it going to fit? So these letters are not going to be bigger, and then you have to squeeze them in. So kind of ghosting it. I get a sense of the size, and I could just literally write it in. And I actually love doing this because when it dries, it looks beautiful. And what I'm going to write is the word water. Now you could do this again stylistically. You may have much, much prettier handwriting. You could do it much looser. Think of graffiti or even stencil. All the ideas that you can come up with. And I may have pushed it a little too. I should have been a little further out. I'm using a little bit of a violet color here. And then I'm going to go with just a nice warm red for the word. So water, ink, and color. And again, you could play with this text. Notice how I'm doing wet on dry and then retouching with a bit of wet on wet. And the more you think about designing, now you're becoming a design. This is more design. From illustration to design, once you add graphics and text, you're dealing with a whole different issue of composition. How to bring it all together. I want to do one last thing that we're going to begin to explore here. So I have this little mop brush. Notice it's a little fluffier. Gives you just a touch of more random, heavier loads of water. And I want to see if I could just, by loading it up with a little bit of color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one brush, hold it in my opposite hand, and then I'm going to tap and spatter a little bit of color right on top of that. Now it takes a little bit of guts, a little bit risky, and hopefully it doesn't land on your face or all over your desk like it did here a little bit. But learning how to use that, I'm just wiping down a little bit that landed on the other side of the page here. You do that quickly, no harm. But learning how to use different types of paint application. So spatter or splash or drop. Any verb you can think of, really. There we go. So I'm going to let this dry just for a second as I walk you through what's going to be the next one. So for the next one, let's see. What I have prepared after our ink pen and brush, I picked an eraser. But in that composition, I'm going to select a few things that are on my desk. And I'm just going to have this eraser. Oh, that's not there yet. So I go from 1 element in one page to 2. Here I'm going to try to do a composition of 3. And waiting for this to fully dry so I don't make a mess. So what I want to do is a composition of 3 elements. Starting with an eraser. So I could do an eraser, a pen, a pencil, a brush, a sharpener. What other things are around your desk, sitting around your desk? What if I did my watercolor case here, my watercolor palette? What kind of composition could I use for that? So thinking again, line, color, how can I use some of the elements that I have going on here and make a nice quick rendering, a full page with 3 elements. Going back to my fine liners, starting with the eraser. And I want to place my eraser, and I'm again thinking of composition. I should select my elements first. So I am going to kind of use this as a model somewhere. This will be one, my watercolor case, the brush, and the eraser. Now that eraser does not make sense there. So what would make sense with an eraser? Adding a pencil to it, I guess, on the side. Or instead of the eraser, add a pen, again, using what we're going for today. So instead of the eraser, maybe you go back to the pen or a different type of pen. In my case, I'll leave up the eraser in case anyone wants to do that one. And I'm going to do these kind of quick sketched using a brush, using my watercolor case, and a pen. That's what I'm going to do. So 3 elements. I'm going to go ahead and angle this so I get a quick read of how I'm going to angle them and compose them. So this is going to be, it's not timed, but I want my lines, I want you to notice how loose my lines are going to be here. The element of line and color and what I'm trying to do with it is going to be, in one word, playful is what I'm looking for. Really playful. What it does is years and years from now. So in the year, let's say 2031, on the same day, October 22nd, 2031, when you go back and you open this sketchbook and you look at this specific page, it brings you right back here to October 22nd, 2021. Remembering what was happening in the moment, literally as we speak right now, reliving the experience between you and these things that are right in front of you. But most importantly, the experience between you, the pen, the paper, and what you're about to do with color. And this one's going to be easy because I'm just going to pull the color right from it into it, wash it, give it a little bit of contrast in some areas. So there's my watercolor box. I'm going to use this brush as my model. And once again, I'm going to go ahead and add, I was thinking about one diagonal this way and one diagonal this way. So my brush and my pen, I don't want them to compete. So I'm going to use this pen first as my model, my Faber-Castell. Do a quick deconstruction. And what if they overlapped? I think it's going to be a little bit better this way. what are the kinds of decisions? How are you making those decisions? In terms of composition, it's visual education. You need to educate yourself how things are organized on a page, how you like them to be, understanding why it works, why it doesn't work. They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But when you're the one composing, what are those keys? Is it that quality of light? There's my pen. And now here comes my brush. So this brush, I want to give a little bit of extra care at the tip. So it's not about the handle so much. Very thin. Coning a little bit here. Now here's all my where I want my effort and my attention to be. Between these little red copper wires holding it up with that beautiful shape. And just like that, we have a composition where I could have maybe added a couple more elements. Now, how's this composition working? We shall find out. Color is going to bring it together. I'm going to use the same palette to very quickly dip, give it a little bit of a sense, like realistic sense, like putting the colors where they actually go. So as you see me here picking up a color, putting it in the spot where it goes, very casually, very but not random at all, just this type of stroke, not really staying within the lines. Pace. I always talk about pace. How pace is really, really important. And what do I mean by pace? If you feel you're working way too fast or way too slow, both of those could be plus or actually can hurt you. If you feel you're working too fast without a little bit of patience, you could be skipping through steps that need a little bit of time to develop, like letting something dry or to create a layer or a shadow. That's a big one. If you're working too slow, maybe you're overthinking it and you're too tight with the lines and the way you're seeing the thing. So either or, you need to realize, how is this helping or hurting? And it usually is in the moment when you have to not overthink it, but almost feel your way through it, is the way I would put it. You kind of have to feel your way through it. And that's what I mean by saying, well, we're here to have fun. Don't forget you're here to have fun. This is supposed to be a fun experience where you're hopefully learning something new. Yes. Also creating something beautiful and new. Yes. But willing to make mistakes, learn from the mistakes. A big part of it. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, that they're not necessarily rules, but if there were rules in what we're doing, what would they be? I'd come up with 3 of them. And those 3 would be, number 1, most important, have fun. Find a way to have fun. Number 2 is no fear. There's no reason to have fear. And it's not just the fear of trying something new, making a mess. It's a little bit of the fear of what the expectation is, what it's supposed to look like, what it's going to look like. Or what if it doesn't? You know, you're anticipating, you're getting ahead of the process. Number 3, be kind, be nice to yourself and to the work you just created. Usually that's one of the biggest factors that can stop your development, your process of growing as an artist, is every time you do anything, you look at it and you rip it apart. You, oh my gosh, it's no good. This is nothing, blah, 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 blah. And it's all that little voice in your head telling you sometimes way negative things. I call it almost like a bully. And it depends. The opposite of that is, yay, everything is beautiful, everything's great, and it is, but there's no constructive criticism going on. So you want that healthy, kind, nice, true, honest analytics of what you are and not wanting to achieve there. Not forgetting what the main reason for all of this was, which is to have fun, to lose a little bit of that fear, and to let your feelings come through. In the end, great works of art, you name it, whether it's music, poetry, literature, movies, paintings, they have deep, undeniable truths in them. And the author, the creator, was willing to risk vulnerability. Hey, listen, I felt this way, and I know some of you may have as well. So here it is. So risking that, letting other people see how you're feeling, in the end, it comes through. Whether you want it or not, it's showing through. Every line, every stroke that we're creating today. And that's what I'm trying to get at. Don't overthink it, but know how to interpret your line and what you're doing with line and color. So this one I would see smaller text, maybe a quote about what we're doing today, maybe the rules. Let's go ahead and do that. This one I could do a little bit more. Using a little bit of a different style of text, a little more loose, risking, have fun. Never forget to do that. Adding a little bit of wet on wet, and look at the beautiful things you can do with sometimes just a quick stroke. And also expanding your typography. How to use text, letters, symbols as graphics. Let's go with this one here. So there's some image ink line color and expanding it to a little bit of text. Always, in the end, thinking about how composition is working together. So there we have it. A 3, 2, 1 element composition. And now we're going to move from our desk to somewhere else. And that's going to be other elements around you, daily life, just outside your window. And I love nature. Elements of nature. We're going to give a lot more emphasis to this type of composition. So you have a set of leaves here. Now you could play with the color. These look a little dried, but you could shift the color. What I want you to see here is this. There's a lot of quality of line, beautiful shapes, and there's also shifting light and shadow. So you have variations of color within color, light, and shadows of the same color. How would you bring about this type of drawing or this application of color? I'm saying, because I'm going back to previous pages and how it's going to come together as you flip the pages, going in this direction. So I'm not going to do it straight vertical. I'm going to angle it a little bit in this direction. I'm going to use, in this case, I'm going to use, for this one, I'm going to use my water soluble ink. Now, is that going to be helpful? It will give it an interesting look. Micron. I know we're working with pen and ink. Sometimes you want to give yourself maybe a little bit of a pencil. And I would really encourage you not to try that. Usually you would go, oh, let me do a little bit of a pencil sketch and then do my ink work. The rehearsal sometimes could be the one you want instead of kind of going over it. Hard to explain, but sometimes in that first search, you find exactly what you needed. So to then go over it and not just double the work, but why would you? It's maybe giving yourself some markers. So like I would do here, that's where I want it to end. So that means my proportions. And notice how I'm just tapping dots. And you may not see them, but they're there. And I'm getting a little closer. That's it, just tapping a few dots that I could almost do away with, or I could leave in, just giving myself information on how to proportion the image to this page. Now, one thing that I really want you to do here, and it would be great if you do, I want you to look at the image, look at the computer, see the image, or if you have a plant nearby, if you have a plant in your line of sight that you could bring almost right next to your desk, look at the negative space between and around the subject. So not just the actual shapes, but what I want you to do is, as you draw your shapes, can you please keep your eyes on the reference 100% of the time? This is called blind drawing. Now you're going to have really, really interesting results here as I go all the way around the edge. And I'm guessing you could see where I am. Now, have I glanced at my paper? I did twice, 3 times now, where I feel I need the right read of proportion. And look, it's not going to fit completely. It's not going to fit entirely as I planned, but I have this whole side, and now using this information where what I was reading was negative space, I could come back and using the thickness, really finding yourself. Maybe let's go this way. There's so many ways to do this, and it is probably the easiest way that gets you the farthest, fastest in terms of drawing. Really seeing Notice here it overlaps, so we continue that shape, and I could follow that line and then match where the opposite, and this is juxtaposition of the other, follows. Coming right back into the line, finding the next spot where I see it continues, but because of this line here, I know it marks this shape of negative space that comes right into the bottom and gives me this new. Here's where I could maybe continue. And the beautiful thing about this is because it's organic, it's nature, it's very forgiving. Truly very forgiving. It's only you making the judgment. Oh no, that doesn't look exactly like I see it here. And there we have it. So already I have something that, okay, I know it kind of looks like what's in front of me. How much closer can I get it? Now it's finding these spots and continue inner negative space where I'm going to just simply connect some of these lines. Find where I am in the drawing and just simply begin to add the lines that I feel I need to, because you don't need to add every single line. And realizing that is probably one of the most important things. How I manage this negative space here, the overlap of some of these and how they connect to where I saw them. And in many ways, a new way of seeing. I know it's a complicated concept if you've never done it before, thinking of negative space. And if so, it still demands a different type of focus. What we've been doing earlier with some of the other elements, that deconstruction, that piecing it from what I see, and look at this, finding where I am in the next line, losing your place, sometimes having patience, and making sure you stop, think, analyze, bring in that intellect, and blend just a little bit of intuitive. And then how much? That's what we call art, basically. In one swift, you're seeing it. It's a different way of seeing. So what am I seeing? How am I seeing it is the question. And then the tools I'm using. So in this case, so this line is not going to make sense. It was curving. And guess what? I can live with it. As I continue finding areas of negative space, connecting those lines, I don't want to lose that sense of how I got here. And just by rushing it, lose it. And there I have it. There it is. There's my drawing. Did not fit completely. I didn't angle it more than I needed to angle it a little more. Because I used the water-soluble ink, I could get away with this, just adding water to it and having some of those shadow, darker. So I'm going to do that first. And my quality of line was maybe a little too consistent. Meaning it's going to have this same overall consistency to it in terms of value. That's what I should mention there. So I could lift as I add water. I could tap and lift some of that. I could also make a mess. And remember, I'm going to be adding a little bit of color here as well. But finding these areas, these spots first. And I'm looking for contrast, those darker. Now, remember the no fear, where I could get somewhat, I don't want to say careless, but I could bring in a larger brush. This is a number 7 round brush, where I could just really just add water. And look at this chaos that I could cause here. Now, this is a technique that I absolutely would use myself, where you see the looseness of some of this brush stroke, creating things that technically it's me doing it, but I give credit to the water and the brush and somewhat my subconscious. Because how am I making that decision? And look at that beautiful streak here. Where, whoa, but you're losing all of that beautiful quality you had going on with the line. And now this wash looks a little too saturated. It's testing. I wouldn't recommend doing this just like that, like I did right away. It takes a bit of testing and practice. Now, I would let this dry just a little longer as I begin to apply dabs of color. Notice that I've been lifting all the way through when I started. And that's also because I used the water-soluble ink. This wouldn't happen like this if I use the micron. So using the right type of ink to create washes. Now there's ink that's really, really water soluble that you may not want to use this technique with, because it will really just I don't want to say become a mess, but it's that borderline. It's that borderline. People sometimes say it, that certain things, when they're really, really fun, they tend to be maybe a little more, I don't want to say dangerous. So it's a little bit of that. For those who like jumping out of a plane, skydiving, well, there's a risk. But there's supposed to be a huge rush. And all you see me do now is consider a little bit of this wet on wet, how I can manage a shift in the colors, letting it blend with what's already there from, but I'm almost beginning to move away a little bit from the actual image and beginning to develop what I have going on here on its own, what actually came together, which ideally is the goal. When you're working from life, you're doing a portrait, you don't want it to be just a photo. You want to add a little bit of what it is you see as you look at this person. In this case, as you look at this little set of leaves, as this plant. And I go back to that feeling, evoking that feeling. What can we see? What can we get beyond that line and color? So I'm using a variation of 3, as you notice here. 3 little bit lighter, yellow ochre. I added a bit of burnt umber, and then to the third one, I added a little bit of red to the mix. So there's 3 variations as I see them here. And I have been also squinting at my image where I could see a little difference between those 3 types. And I think that's pretty far. That's where I would stop with color. And then I'm just going to add one last final detail here. And the way I see it is, I would have to let it dry just a little longer, because what I want to do is such fine detail, and it is a lot darker. So I'm adding black or Payne's gray to that mixture that I had with this yellow ochre, burnt umber, and red. And it's this very fine darkest little vine that connects all of our leaves. Now, because I need it to be darker and also sharper, I would wait till it's fully dry. Here I'm moving ahead so we can do our last exercise. And you can also see how this could easily, and it was developed quickly. But once again, it's not about speed, it's about pace. And the pace here demanded that I should have waited just a little bit longer. But what do you think about that chaotic wash that was applied? Now it begins to make sense. Now I almost wish I had a little more over here in this area. And sometimes the timing of it, the strategy of the timing, when you feel, oh yeah, that was perfect timing, that's right, and then having to go back in, it's when it's wrong. When you miss time it, strategized the step. Reminds me of that cartoon where you're painting the walls and then you start here and then whoops, you're trapped in a corner. How do I get out of here? You could do that by not thinking ahead of layers and maybe not working the bigger, simpler things first. As you get smaller and smaller, more complex, it gets harder to go back to bigger because now you have too many small things that could be affected by it. So it's not going to be loose, big, and simple. It's going to be contained and tight. All right, so I have one last image. And that image would be this one. Adding a little vase. And this one could be really fun. So again, we're looking at what would be the look from photorealistic to stick figure almost. And when I mean stick figure would be just almost beyond cartoon or caricature of it. It's finding that style. How do I approach this in terms of line, style? How do I consider line, shapes, value, color, space, negative space, light? Do I even consider space or light? Because you can make it flat, fully flat, and no light. So just flat washes with color. All of these decisions is what makes art, I honestly think, beautiful, because there's 7 billion ways. There's 7 billion ways to paint this, and maybe more than that. Actually, no, for a fact, more than that. Because every single human being would see this and do this in a completely different way. And it's always beautiful to see. So waiting for this to dry just a little longer. And here we go. I'm going to use a paper towel just to hold that between them. There we are. Okay, so where would I start? What am I thinking about? Just going to grab this very quickly. All the different ideas that come from looking at an image. Sometimes you need to spend a few minutes, sometimes days, studying, looking, setting up your subject for what you're going to do. Now, the other way would be to just sketch, and exercise that out until you, have that moment where I got it. And sometimes you don't know how it happened. You don't even realize how you got there. But it is through really just thinking about it. Going back to fine liner. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this left side a little more, not in the center. I'm going to go a third of the way. So that's one of those composition rules. If you've ever heard of the rule of thirds, and I should visualize that, I'll show you next week, where instead of drawing a center line right down the middle and a center line right across, you divide it into thirds. So 3 segments vertically, 3 segments horizontally. And then you can have those intersections. So mostly right there, thinking about where that would intersect, I'm going to put that vase and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller here. So notice the quality of my line. I'm going right into this kind of scumbly sketch, seeing that triangle, the cone, and then that ball almost here at the bottom. I do love the shadow of it, and if I do work with light a little bit, I'm going to want to play with that. A little bit of this curve here, it shows beautifully. Just the switch line, there's my vase. Now there's a little bit of shadow, and I could enhance that with a few strokes of a pen here. And there's that beautiful light coming through here. And we go right back into negative space. So for me, this is where I really exercise and practice the method of blind drawing. So trusting what you see. These are the best exercises. I did that right there without ever looking at the paper. I started by placing the pen. So I look at the paper, place my pen where it's supposed to be, and then looking at my reference, which is, it's in sort of my line sight, but I'm not even, glancing for half a second at it. Although it's in my line of vision, it just comes through practice. So setting my pen once again where I think it goes, and following shape and drawing the space, negative space in this case, between all of these little leaves. Now some of them I want to switch their shape. They're a little small, so I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And here we have one that's juxtaposed, overlapped. So I know what I'm doing. And I'm going to come back around, get a little proportion there, and have some of this bigger element. So nice, interesting, this little triangular negative space here, one of those that is crucial. Takes me to the other side, and I'm going to develop it this way, where I could see it a little bit easier. And sometimes you have these drawings where if you really go full blind drawing, they overlap, they juxtapose, they kind of... The best way to do it is when you do portraits and the eyes end up where the nose was supposed to be. But that is what the practice, what the method demands. In the practice, to find and discover how it is you're seeing, and then matching how you see to what your hand transcribes. That's the key. And how much you really, really trust what you're seeing to how you're letting your hand copy, only you know. Only you know how, in terms of percentage, how much time are your eyes, ran out of paper here. So you'll find that when sometimes, went out the paper, and it's a little bit off, yes. I got a little too big, maybe up here. But I like it. I like the composition. I can live with it. And as I said, it is the most forgiving way to practice blind drawing. Now, blind drawing, what it does, it really forces you to observe. And then you realize, well, it's just lines. So that's the whole trick. Haha. Yes, that's the whole trick. It's just lines. And finding out how to make beautiful compositions out of groupings of lines. You then give yourself more and more freedom to play with those lines. Yep, I reach another edge. I come back around, see some of these empty spaces. I'm going to add, just for fun, a line back here. And I want some of those shadows. I'm going to play with that a little bit. That's what I want to do. Go to our brush. I'm going to start with a little bit of Venetian red here. Wet on dry, but a lot of this I would do wet on wet. Give myself that looseness. I'm going to keep this a little bit lighter. And then bring just a little bit of shadow on this side by adding Payne's Gray. There's my vase. Notice that you could literally count how many strokes were used for that. I think it was 4. And it's not over brushing. It's not overthinking it. It's not, let's call it 5 now. And then I'm going to go to my invitation for chaos. So here, again, being careful. I want to add a little bit of water. And notice how I'm pretty much adding it all the way outside the lines. And it's just, I like wet on wet much better. The results of them are just, it's the way I like to see it. Watercolor. It's what I expect. And again, your taste, your style may be just a little bit different. So you need to really come to an understanding how you expect and what technique you need to use for that. So notice I'm putting it right at the center of it. And this is just olive green. So a little bit of patience. I don't want to rush this because it won't end up, having a little bit of control. A little bit of control is always good, but not absolute control. I want to be able to allow a little bit of random. Be surprised by some of these magical things that, ooh, look at that. How, I know, technically, it was me that did it, but not really. It's me dropping it almost away from an automatic. It's not necessarily automatic, but it is subconscious. And we get to see almost your life experience, the way you feel about, in this case, nature. Through that, it kind of gets like giddy, like, ooh, exciting. And it shows when it is. And how to achieve that? Practice. Understanding the technique, how far you can push it, what the possibilities beyond that also are. And here's what I wanted to do. So while this is still wet, I wanted to use a little bit of this wet on wet technique to, I know they're not there, but what I wanted to do was play with a little bit of these shadows that seem almost hint at what was happening here. And I want to kind of resemble some of that as it gets a little bit further. And there is something as well to say about really truly understanding how you plan, strategize your technique, the patience you're going to show in order to let some of those layers get to where they need to be. And that's what's going to happen here, because before I begin to add those sharper, and notice here as I try to add sharper, more opaque, well, it's actually dry enough, but you need to know when the timing is right. And I'm just pumping it up. It's a little too red. It should be a little bit darker. And I'll do that in a second pass. So now I'm entering a little more the area of how I'm dealing with light, which would force me to bring in layers of shadow into some of these leaves. And I may have gotten a little bit too thick. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this because I do want to rework it with what I keep saying about patience and good timing for that magic moment. But I do like that. I do like that. I have an idea how that could really, really work. And just to finish up here, I'm going to add a little bit of blue light, very, very light, and let that kind of soak in here. Kind of flood in. We talked about that earlier, how the right timing, when to bring in the technique. Here we want that biggest. Before we get too small, I should have done this earlier as it blends with some of this green. Notice that now we have it there. Now it's going to blend in. Now it's going to work. So I'll let this dry and add those finishing touches, but it's going to be pretty much the same developing and how from a pencil all the way through anything you want to illustrate, anything you want to draw and stylize has the same mind, the strategy, the mind process of you understanding the very simple, specific things. And it goes down, in this case, to line and color, the balance. Hope you guys enjoyed it.